All right. So yeah, welcome. I am, as Michael said, I'm Aaron Halfaker. I'm a principal research scientist at the Wikimedia Foundation. I've worked there since 2011 doing various types of research projects for the organization. And I now run a team called the Scoring Platform team. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we build in the latter half of this talk. But before I do that, I want to talk to you, I want to give you a little bit of a scope and perspective about Wikipedia and the teams that I work on. So as of March 2012, so this data is a little bit out of date, planet Earth was 6.97 billion people. And the number of people who read Wikipedia on a monthly basis is about 500 million, so that's about 1 to 10. So the number of people who edit Wikipedia is dramatically smaller. And by the way, there is a dot there. You might not be able to see it. And that dot is exactly 1 pixel according to my slide generating software. But that's actually way too big. It should be smaller than a pixel. So the Wikipedia editors are about 1 in 10,000 to the number of people who read Wikipedia. Anybody here in the room edit Wikipedia? All right. I know we've got more than 1 in 10,000, so that's pretty good. So we got a lot of Wikipedia editors here. Okay, so I want to zoom into this spot of the graph here so that I can show you some more. So we got the 1 in 10,000 number of people who edit Wikipedia compared to the number of people who read Wikipedia. And the Wikimedia Foundation staff actually, so this slide is a little bit old. We're actually up to about 300 people now. But it's still about 1 in 1,000. 1 in 1,000 staff members who work at the nonprofit that I work for compared to the number of people who edit Wikipedia. We're pretty tiny. The research team is about 5 people. We're like the 6th biggest web property on the internet, and yet our research team is only 6 people. And you'll note that I'm not in the research team group here. It's, because I run a separate team that's sort of like a spin-off from the research department that I just started this year with a couple engineers who work for me that's called the Scoring Platform team. And so one thing that I want to note about this is that we're tiny. Like, we have the tiniest research team for this enormous web property. And a big reason why that still works okay for us is because we collaborate aggressively with external academics. So if you're looking at something that's around Wikipedia or Wikidata or Wiktionary or something like that, and you want to get some grant money, we'll probably sign a letter that you can send to the NSF to help you get some grant money, and we'll collaborate with you and share our data with you. We'll introduce you to the product managers who are developing technologies for Wikipedians because, I mean, our research community is much, much larger than this. This is just the people that we have on staff. Okay, so all right, on to the story. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 things today, because these things should always come in 3s. Pro tip for your presentations, I don't know, human brains are weird. First, I want to talk to you about how I see Wikipedia as a socio-technical system. And so I'm going to draw from a little bit of systems thinking and some biological metaphors. Then I'll talk to you about something that was critical to my thesis work, which is a critique that I wage about the algorithmic quality control systems that Wikipedia uses in order to account for the fact that it's open to the internet and can be edited by anybody. And in order to raise this critique, I'm going to introduce some concepts around standpoint epistemology, and I'm going to talk about how we encode ideologies into the technologies that we build. And then finally, I want to talk about how I think we can fix this problem, an infrastructure for socio-technical change. I want to introduce the concept of a progress catalyst. I'll talk a little bit about some feminist concepts such as hearing to speech as opposed to speaking to be heard, and about the dangers of subjective algorithms and how we can turn those critiques into actual design practices. Okay, on to the socio-technical of Wikipedia. So what is Wikipedia? Well, one thing is kind of obvious. It's the world's largest encyclopedia. There's about 5 million articles in English Wikipedia and quite a few spread over lots and lots of languages. I think we have something on the scale of like 280 languages represented across Wikipedias. Of course, we have lots of languages for Wiktionary, and Wikidata, our structured data store, is language independent, so there's just one of those. So to tell you about what's in Wikipedia, I want to show you this wonderful article called The List of Lists of Lists. And by the way, check this out. I really highly recommend checking out this article on Wikipedia. It's very easy to remember the title. So, and it's exactly what you would expect. It's a list of lists that are lists. And so to dig into this, I want to pick the first thing on the list, which is the list of ancient kings. And so let's go look at that article. And so in the list of ancient kings, we see like all sorts of different types of ancient kings, kings of Persia, Turin king list, and the list of pharaohs. So let's look at the list of pharaohs. And so a lot of these list articles look actually more like articles. They're not just lists of links to articles. And so in this case, this is actually a list, but it's got a lot of prose describing like certain sections of the list. And so it goes in chronological order through time. And so if we scroll down in this article, the first Egyptian king that we'll get is Ptah. And by the way, I know how to pronounce Ptah, and that the P is actually pronounced because we have these cool little IPA pronunciation keys right at the beginning of articles. And yeah, so this is sort of what you can find in the list of lists. I really encourage you to check it out. And it's sort of a good example of what people will do if you make a really cool space for them to contribute on the internet. They'll build the list of lists. Okay, so obviously it's also a wiki. And so wikis are a little bit weird. It's built on top of this software called MediaWiki. Anyone can edit. You actually don't even have to register an account. You can edit while logged out. It'll share your IP address with the world so everybody knows where you live. If you register an account, it won't share your IP address. So you're actually kind of more private if you register an account, but you don't have a name. You're anonymous if you don't log in and register. So there's shared authorship. You know, everybody is editing the exact same articles, and so we have to negotiate what's going to go there because you can't own an article yourself. And it flips the publication model. So you make an edit, you hit save, that's live. You publish first, we worry about review after the fact. It's an online community. It's got about 100,000 active editors, maybe more like 110,000 active editors, and they do a lot of things that online communities do. So in English Wikipedia, there's a large set of forums that are referred to as village pumps, such as the village pump policy, the village pump technical, the village pump proposals, and as you would imagine, these forums gather different types of content, discussions about policy, discussions about technical features, discussions about proposals for new stuff. And we have these subject-specific groups called wiki projects, such as Wiki Project Video Games and Wiki Project Medicine, that focus on just one subspace of the wiki. But I'm a computer scientist, or at least that's how I was trained. I'm sort of a recovering computer scientist. I mean that in a good way, not like there's anything wrong with computer science. But I see Wikipedia as a system. You know, this is just sort of how my brain is wired. It has inputs and outputs. Wikipedia turns available human attention into encyclopedia article stuff. And this is a really cool way to look at something because anytime that you look at something as a system with inputs and outputs, you can ask questions about efficiency. Like, how efficient is this system? Where does the system break down? And where does it actually work really well in surprising ways? And so Wikipedia is a socio-technical system. And I want to explain what I mean when I say socio-technical. So in order to do this, I'm going to draw from a little bit of the history of a field that I publish in that's called computer-supported cooperative work. So long before we had this notion of computer-supported cooperative work, really technology kind of sat beside social things. You would have, maybe dumb terminals that hooked up to a mainframe, and they would generally be in offices. You might have one at home, but if you're not a Richie McFancypants, then you probably wouldn't. You might have one in the office. And you would do social stuff next to it, but no social stuff would really engage with the computer. You might sit around one, but you really wouldn't think of the computer as like an integral part of a social experience. But after a while, we kind of figured out that we could put some social things on computers, such as calendar applications that would help people remember when they were going to meet with each other, and email applications that would help people communicate with each other through computer systems. It turns out that sending text to each other is really cool, and we don't like phones all the time. But what I really want to talk about is a complete mixing of socio-technical, where it's really hard to differentiate what's actually just purely social and what's actually purely technical. And I think Wikipedia falls into this space. I think that there are a lot of things that do fall into this space. In order to do this, I'm a technologist. This arrow is never on the right side. I mean, it is on the whatever. So for a second, I'm going to be a technobiologist. And are there any biologists in the room? Haha, I'm going to get away with murder. Okay, so these are my own sketches, by the way. So on the right side of the screen, or the left side of the screen, I have a bacterium. And on the left side of the screen, the right side of the screen, I have a paramecium. And if you were a biologist, you would look at this and you would say, hey, wait a second, that paramecium is way too big. Like that bacterium is way too big. Comparing the size of a paramecium and a bacterium is really, really difficult because this bacterium would actually be smaller than those little dots that the paramecium is pooping out right there. And so it's the scale that I want to talk to you about a little bit. A bacterium operates at a massively smaller scale than a paramecium. So bacterium is really, really simple. It's really just like kind of like a sack of salt water. It's got some DNA that's just kind of floating loose inside the sack. There's some little capsules, like these little lipid capsules called vacuoles, and there's these things called ribosomes that sort of aid in transcription from DNA to proteins. But inside a paramecium, there's a whole bunch of these really cool subsystems that allow it to operate at a much larger scale, such as an endoplasmic reticulum that takes the ribosomes and makes them much more effective at transcoding DNA into proteins, much larger and specialized vacuoles like the contractile vacuole, which is a really cool thing. It's like a pump. And it sits in the back of the if a paramecium had a back, sits in the back of the paramecium, and it pumps water out of the cell. And the really cool thing about this is if you know anything about osmosis, then you'll know that if you take a sack of salt water and you put it in a freshwater lake, it will explode because all of that fresh water wants to rush into the saltwater environment. And so what a paramecium does is it's constantly pumping water out of itself. If that contractile vacuole stops pumping, then the paramecium explodes if it's in a freshwater lake. And so that cool subsystem allows the paramecium to operate in spaces where single-celled organisms just couldn't operate. So when I see a bacterium and a paramecium, and I think about human populations, I like to compare a bacterium to a small fishing village. Has anybody here heard of Dunbar's number? Okay, so Dunbar is a social scientist who was studying people who occupied small fishing villages. And one of the things that he happened to notice is that a fishing village never really gets above about 150 people. And so the insight that Dunbar had is that 150 is a really important number for humans that are operating in a collective way. You know, it doesn't seem that humans operate in a collective way at a size above 150. But what I think Dunbar was really getting at is that humans need important subsystems in order to operate at larger scales than 150. And so when we look at the scale at which Wikipedia operates, which is 110,000 people who are coordinated across the globe, that's much more like a paramecium. It's enormous. Comparing a fishing village to Wikipedia is just night and day. It's 3 orders of magnitude. And so they operate at these massively different scales. When we look at a paramecium, I was talking about how it's got these important subsystems that allow it to operate at this scale. If we were to look at a paramecium as just the baramecium, which is essentially the saltwater sac and a few vacuoles, and try and look at the organelles separate, that wouldn't really make sense. The whole thing works together as a system. The contractile vacuole doesn't work without the other cellular systems to support it. In the same way, when you look at Wikipedia, you can't look at the people who work on Wikipedia. By the way, that's a photo from Wikimania, one of our global conferences that we have once a year. You can't look at the people separate from the technologies that they use, or the technologies that they use separate from the people. The technologies that people use and the people are part of the exact same system, and you have to look at them together. So when I say socio-technical, I mean the merging of these two things, that you can't look at the social without looking at the technical, in the same way that you can't study a paramecium by just looking at its organelles. And so that's socio-technical. And so just as paramecium is a system with specialized subsystems that operates at a massive scale, Wikipedia is a system with specialized subsystems that operates at a massive scale. So I want to talk about some of those subsystems. So let's pick on work allocation. We need to identify, prioritize, and assign tasks. People are going to have to work on something, and we should work on the most important things first. How are we going to do that? Well, we largely get that free due to this process called Linus's Law. And I actually don't mean something with Linus, the Linux kernel founder. I actually mean Linus's Law is formulated by Eric Raymond, which is given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And so I never set up that joke, right? So essentially the idea is that if you have enough people looking at the same problem, to one person the solution to that problem is going to look very obvious, and they'll be able to put very little effort into fixing it. And so this is one of the reasons that open source software works as well as it does. So the insight of this is that visibility is critical to open collaboration systems. If you have a lot of people who can see something, then they're able to collaborate together much better in order to do things efficiently. And so my corollary for Wikipedia is that given enough people see an incomplete article, all potential contributions to that article will be easy for somebody. And the research backs this up. It turns out that it generally works in theory. It's part of the process of becoming a Wikipedia and a Wikipedia editor. We can support that visibility with technology and see the benefits of it. And really bad things happen when we take away the visibility. Fun story. Okay, on to the next subsystem. So regulation of behavior. We need to formulate norms, like make up rules, we need to propagate them, and we need to enforce them because we all need to write the same encyclopedia, and we should probably do it consistently. This is probably the most commonly studied thing about Wikipedia, because how can a system that has no central governance strategy actually govern itself? There's nobody in charge of Wikipedia, the Wikimedia Foundation. We don't tell them what to do. We don't design the rules. We don't enforce the rules. Random internet people do it themselves. And so if you go to Google Scholar and you search for Wikipedia governance, it's going to tell you that it thinks that it's going to pull up 37,000 results. That's not quite right. I mean, it's kind of ballparking these sort of things. But if you go to page 10 of the results, you'll still find studies that are relevant to the study of governance and Wikipedia. And so I really want to convey that this is a really well-studied thing. I just want to talk, there's a lot of things that I could talk to you about, but I just want to talk to you about how Wikipedians do this. So when they're coming up with a rule, there's two different types of rules: a prescriptive rule, which is really we should do this, and a descriptive rule, which is we've been doing this, so we should probably write that down so that new people know how we do things. You write that down, and Wikipedians call this an essay as it starts out. And then when you think that that's ready, you'll submit a request for comments, and a bunch of people will come and discuss the merits or drawbacks of implementing this essay as a new rule. And if it passes that request for comments, then it becomes something that we call either a policy or a guideline. And if it doesn't pass it, then it goes back to being an essay, and you could fix it up and submit it to another request for comments again. And so essentially essays and policies and guidelines separate two different types of written down norms that are in Wikipedia: formal and informal norms. Formal norms are like the rules that get applied, period. And informal norms are discussions of how things ought to be. And it turns out that these things have really interesting dynamics in Wikipedia. So I want to give you an example of an informal norm and a formal norm. So informal norm, one of my favorites, is don't stuff beans in your nose, which is a policy about don't tell the vandals not to do something that they haven't already done already, because maybe they haven't thought of that yet. And anybody who has kids will know that you don't tell your kids not to put beans in their nose, because then they're going to be like, holy crap, beans will fit my nose. And they're going to put beans in their nose. And then a formalized policy, arguably, so I would argue this is the most important formal policy in Wikipedia, which is verifiability. Stated plainly, Wikipedia is verifiable, not truth, because what is truth anyway, and we can debate that for forever. Wikipedia instead will include information that can be verified with an external source. So if there are external sources that disagree, then you report the disagreement and cite the verifiable things for both sides of an argument or in sides of an argument. All right, and so I just want to talk quick about like the growth of these kind of regulations. So up until 2006, our formalized norms, like the rules, were growing pretty steadily. This plot is just showing the growth over time of these things. So we're still growing after 2006, but we're growing much, much slower. All the way until 2010, when I finished this analysis, basically the rules really aren't growing that much at all. But the essays are growing like nuts. And so people are still writing about ideas about how things ought to be in Wikipedia, despite the fact that we're not really turning them into rules. I'm going to come back to that later. But before that, I want to talk about the quality control subsystem. Arguably an important thing. You open up a web page to the internet, it's going to fill up with garbage. And so we need to identify and remove the damage in Wikipedia. So quality control looks a lot like the many eyes problem. So if you have many people looking at an article on Wikipedia, somebody's going to notice that there's vandalism in there or something that's not quite right, and they'll be able to fix it up. This works okay, especially because Wikipedia has a lot of viewers, but it's not perfect because some pages don't get viewed that often. And so we have these technologies to sort of supplement this natural process of people reviewing pages. On the fully automated side, we have bots that use machine learning to detect edits that are very obviously vandalism. They will automatically revert that vandalism, and they're really fast. It takes them about 5 seconds from when the edit is saved to actually submitting the reversion of the edit. Requires no human effort except for, of course, building the bot and maintaining the bot. But it only works for obvious vandalism. Everything that gets past that, where it might be vandalism, but it's not obvious enough to be automatically reverted, goes to one of the semi-automated systems. And so these are human computation systems. They're designed to have a human in the loop of a partially automated system still pretty fast. Humans will revert vandalism about 30 seconds after it's saved. It's designed to minimize human effort, and luckily most humans can catch most vandalism at a glance. It's really easy to see when something's terribly wrong, much harder to see when something's maybe looks pretty okay but isn't the best information. There's another level of review that we have around watch lists, but I don't want to get into that. But what I really want to tell you about is that there are a lot of processes in Wikipedia that all fit together. So people just randomly finding problems in Wikipedia, using the fully automated tools and the semi-automated tools, all work together in this cool documentary practice of warnings that will eventually, like once you get a level 4 warning in Wikipedia, you automatically get reported to the administrator's notice board, the administrator intervention against vandalism, and then you can be banned from Wikipedia. And so the really cool part of this, and why I want to bring this back to the biological metaphor, is this looks like a mammalian immune system, where it has innate characteristics that the fully and semi-automated tools are fast, they're general in that they work inside the entire encyclopedia, and they're local in that they solve a problem exactly where it occurs. It's like if you got an infection on your arm and it gets a little bit swollen. That's your innate immune system. Whereas your adaptive immune system, when we usually refer to when you get an immunity to something, it's slow. You usually don't develop an immunity right away. You're going to be sick for a few days. But it's specific to a particular pathogen, and it's global. It works across your entire body. Once you have that adaptive immunity, you won't get that pathogen again. You're now immune to that pathogen. And that's how Wikipedians are banning people from Wikipedia. When you get banned from Wikipedia, you can't come back and harass us again. Your specific IP address and user agent are out. And Wikipedians have some ways to deal with people who use proxies and that sort of stuff that work pretty effectively. I don't think, and if this wasn't obvious, I don't think it's a coincidence that Wikipedians came up with this process, and so did evolutionary biology. Okay, community management. We need to socialize and train the newcomers. Not everybody's good at writing an encyclopedia. We need to mediate disputes and generally provide training. So Wikipedia gets about 6,000 newcomers today, and that looks a lot like a fire hose. It's just way too many people. If anybody here has ever been involved in a socialization program in a company, you never have to do with 6,000 people a day, and some of them are vandals. But we address this by having a robot called HostBot that splits off the newcomers who are at least trying to contribute productively from the people who are obviously vandals, and routes the people who are at least trying to contribute productively to some of our newcomer help spaces, such as the Tea House, which is sort of like a question and answer space for newcomers. They're really cool. They have this culture around answering the same question over and over again. I'm sure that people in this room might be familiar with RTFM, read the fucking manual. That's what you say to people when you've heard a question too many times. They have an explicit culture around never saying that. They'll just answer the same question over and over again. If you don't want to answer it, then go let somebody else answer it. And so it's a really nice space for newcomers to show up. All right, and then finally, and this subsystem I think is often overlooked, Wikipedia operates independently of any centralized control. So it's going to have to decide how it's going to change. It needs to reflect and adapt, to ask the questions, where are we going, where do we want to go, and how would we want to get there? And so I was talking before about the way that rules are formed, which is part of the adaptation mechanism as I see it. So what I see, or what I think is really happening here, is that the formalized norms, the formalized rules are adaptation. They dramatically change how Wikipedia operates. Whereas when people write essays, they're reflecting. They're asking this question, like, where are we going and how do we want to get there? And we can see that there's a very different dynamic in what's happening with reflection and adaptation. Okay. So coming back to this metaphor, like, why am I talking about biology? Well, you know, like a paramecium, it's really just like chemicals running into each other. And it's really hard to look at like one chemical or one organelle or one subpart of the system without trying or actually accounting for the entire whole. You've really got to study the whole system. And in the same way, Wikipedia is a bunch of people and technologies working together, and the rules that they form working together in like a sort of intermixed gears system where you turn one gear and all the other gears turn. And so I really want you to think about this as like a system that's tightly integrated. If you change the technology, change the social practices. If you change the social practices, the technologies are going to follow. Okay, and so that's really what I mean when I say that I see Wikipedia as a socio-technical system. Okay. Part two, on to what the heck is going wrong with this quality control system. Okay, so I'm going to briefly summarize a paper that I published in 2012 using this graph right here, which is showing you the number of active editors in English Wikipedia. In the early days of Wikipedia, between 2001 and 2004, it was a fishing village. There were less than 150 people editing Wikipedia. They all sort of knew each other, and that knowing each other and knowing what each other was up to allowed them to form all the basic infrastructures that they really needed to make the project maintainable. And so they didn't really have very many technologies intermixed with their social processes. However, at the start of 2004, everything kind of turned into a fire hose. This is when Wikipedia started getting really popular. Google started to rank Wikipedia really high because it looks beautiful from Google's link ranking perspective. And so people started to reel from this and go, holy cow, how the heck do we deal with this fire hose? And so they built a lot of technologies that helped them do it. I was talking before about the quality control tools that they built in order to deal with this influx of new content. And so Huggle is an example of one of the semi-automated quality control tools, and ClueBot-NG is an example of one of the fully automated quality control tools. And so essentially they started changing their infrastructure to be much more technical than it was before. So I want to talk about one of the technologies that's really critical to the quality control tools, and that's the machine classifier. So machine classifier essentially takes a set of statistics, in this case about an edit in Wikipedia. Was the person who saved it anonymous, or were they logged in? How many what's the longest sequence of repeated characters? People like to just go K, 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 and then save that in Wikipedia, so that's a pretty good signal. Or especially, how many bad words did they add in it? Did they add a lot of curse words and racial slurs, that sort of stuff? You would imagine these things would be kind of predictive. So you put that into a machine learning model, it does something. And it outputs good or bad. You sort of train it based on these statistics, figure out some correlations for me. And this, as you can imagine, becomes incredibly useful. So using one of these machine learning models, you can take the flow of edits into Wikipedia, 160,000 edits per day, and you can split it into the 10% that need review and the 90% that are almost certainly okay and can just skip the whole review process, saving people about an order of magnitude of time. And so without machine prediction, reviewing that 160,000 edits per day takes about 267 hours. And so that's about 33 people working 8 hours a day. But with machine prediction, we only need to review 16,000 edits a day, which still sounds like a big number, but that's only 27 hours. So 3 or 4 people doing about 8 hours a day. And so you can imagine that this was a massive technology. It really, really helped Wikipedia operate at scale, deal with the fire hose. Yet after this point, we see this abrupt decline. And what the heck? Why did Wikipedia go from this exponential growth pattern to an abrupt decline? Well, I'm going to tell you. But before I tell you that, I want to talk to you about some bits of the feminist literature that I find really informative for understanding what's going on here. So I'm going to draw from Donna Haraway, who talked a lot about standpoints and objectivity. So Donna Haraway was studying scientists who were studying apes, an ape studying apes who study apes. Essentially what she was doing is looking at groups of scientists who were very patriarchal in their approach to scientific practice, and groups of scientists who were sort of informed by feminism at the time. I think she was doing this in the late 70s, but I'm not actually sure about the time period. So these weren't really female scientists and male scientists. They were sort of feminist-informed scientists and patriarchal scientists, but I believe that she used these labels. But I put the star there to show that science still isn't dominated by women, at least not the study of apes. So both of these groups of scientists were looking at the exact same subject, apes and their social behaviors. But they looked at very different things. So the quote-unquote male scientists were looking at reproductive competition and dominance patterns, while the female or feminist scientist labs were looking at communication and social grooming. So in order to make sense of what was going on here, Donna used these terms. That standpoint is gives you a view on what's important and valuable. Like, are you interested in communication patterns, or are you interested in sexual selection and dominance? Who gets to mate and have kids? How evolution happens. An objectivity is what you construct to reify this value. Are you going to look at grooming patterns, or are you going to look at sexual partners? But like the critical insight that Donna had was saying, like, neither of these are better than each other. It's actually better when we have both. We should actually merge these things because we can extend our understanding. When we ask different questions and value different things, we look at different aspects of ape behavior and we come to know ape behavior better. And so today, if you were to look at a textbook about ape behavior, it should tell you about reproductive competition and dominance and communication and social grooming. We have a better understanding of apes because we had different standpoints that looked at the problem, built different objectivities to explore it, and then learned different things about ape behavior. Neither is wrong. Both of them are more right together. Okay, so let's look at the standpoint of editors in Wikipedia during that exponential growth period where everything was becoming a fire hose. So Wikipedia is a fire hose. Bad edits need to be reverted, and we need to get those out of the encyclopedia. And we should minimize the effort that we waste doing quality control work so we can get back to writing articles. Okay, so and the way that we built an objectivity, or the way that they built an objectivity for that, is they designed these tools that use machine learning models and were engineered around efficiency to efficiently get rid of the bad stuff. Cool. And this was a massive success. As I said before, it works really, really well. So right now we have essentially these tools standing between the internet and Wikipedia, and they reduce the workload by about 90%, which is phenomenal. And I already told you about the numbers. Okay, so it wasn't until 2009 that we realized, like, whoa, holy cow, the newcomers are not sticking around in Wikipedia, like something's going terribly wrong. We were exponentially growing, and now we're declining. What the heck is happening? And then it took until 2012 before we sort of had a handle on what exactly was happening here. There were a lot of hypotheses that I looked at to try and explain what was going on here. And I'll save you those. Maybe we can get to those in the question and answer. I'll just tell you what the conclusion was. And so generally what the conclusion is that it turns out when you split off the 10% of stuff that really needs to be reviewed, it's not 10% of bad stuff. It's really about like 2% of vandals and 8% newcomers who aren't quite doing things exactly right and who really need help. And so the vast majority of people who were targeted by these quality control tools, they weren't really intending to do bad. They just happened to be doing something that wasn't great. And so essentially what was happening was that the quality control subsystem got really, really strong, got really, really big, and squashed the community management system, and we were throwing out the baby with the bathwater. If you edited Wikipedia after 2007, somebody hit you over the head with a hammer. And if you edited Wikipedia before 2007, people would be like, hey, how you doing? This is great. You should come and work more. And so then our standpoint was expanded. We realized, hey, maybe we should also value newcomers having a good experience and design for that, not just design for this efficient quality control practice. And so let's review our standpoint. So Wikipedia is still a fire hose. Bad edits still need to be reverted. We would still like to minimize the effort wasted on quality control work. However, we would also like to socialize and train the newcomers. Cool. Expanded standpoint. And that gets incorporated. So between 2012 and 2015, the conversation about Wikipedia and what our new initiative looks like started to incorporate the standpoint. So more newcomers in Wikipedia became a major Wikimedia Foundation goal, and newcomer help spaces were developed for supporting newcomers. And so I talked to you about the Tea House. The co-op is sort of like a newcomer mentoring space where you can get one-on-one help with somebody over a long period of time. So win, right? We had this expanded standpoint. We built these new objectivities. Well, it turns out that a lot of things didn't change, didn't account for this new standpoint. And so I'm going to pick on part of the quality control system, Huggle, but really this critique actually applies to the whole thing. So when I talk about Huggle, so my ethnographic field site are the people who develop these quality control tools. And so I often give a talk that's very similar to this to them. And so I want to give you what I say before I get into the critique of the system. So let's start with the sugar. So Huggle is an amazing piece of software. I have no doubt that it represents the state-of-the-art in distributed quality control. Today, or actually it was a week ago, I was presenting at Quora, and I found out that Quora, Facebook, Google, they all have something that looks exactly like Huggle. Huggle was developed in 2006. They didn't develop these tools until like a year ago. So it was way ahead, way the state of the art. This software and its users are responsible for critical work, and they're all volunteers. Its developers and its users are wonderful people. I know lots of them personally, and we all owe them a lot for their thankless work. So let me take this opportunity. Sorry. I like them. They're my people. To thank you. Okay, now the medicine. So this is what Huggle looked like in 2009 when that first study was published that Wikipedia was declining. So, so I should explain the interface first. So we're looking at a diff of an edit in Wikipedia. Somebody removed the content. She smells like bad body odor. So probably a good edit. So when you're reviewing edits in Wikipedia, you click these buttons in the upper left. The one on the left is if it's bad, and the one on the right is if it's good. If you click that bad one, it'll revert the edit and send a message to that person saying, stop vandalizing Wikipedia, we're going to ban you, starting that warning cycle that I was talking about would eventually result in that administrator's intervention against vandalism. And there's this list on the left that uses the machine learning model to rank edits by the likelihood that they're bad. And so at the very top is probably bad, and at the bottom is probably less bad. And so you start off on the worst stuff and work down the list until it's mostly good, and then you can stop. And a lot of people are using this tool at the same time. So after we had this conversation and standpoints are expanded and we're trying all these newcomer initiatives, this is what Huggle looked like in 2015 after a major redesign. Lots more gradients, a little bit rounder. But really, we still have this diff space. We still have a button for good and bad. We still have this list on the side that ranks things from probably bad to probably less bad. They did add a button to welcome newcomers, and as far as I can tell, no one's ever clicked that button, but it does exist there. But still, this interface is really optimized to efficiently get rid of the bad stuff. So the state today is that quality control in Wikipedia is still not really designed with newcomer socialization in mind. And newcomers, and especially those who don't conform to what Wikipedia, the early Wikipedians looked like, remain marginalized, which is basically like white, bearded, middle-aged American men. And so we're still not seeing gains in retention of good faith newcomers. Like, the graph isn't really declining, but our population model still has a really abysmal retention rate. So why? Why didn't this adapt? Why did we extend our standpoint and our objectivities other places but not here? So yeah, why did some of the subsystems adapt and not all of them? So here I want to talk about the potential for some infrastructure for socio-technical change, like how you can actually try and make a change in a system where there's no centralized control. I can't tell people what to do. So this core technology that's part of these quality control tools, the machine classifier. So as I said before, it takes a set of statistics about an edit, learns correlations between good and bad, and then makes predictions about good and bad. So there's three main quality control tools that are running in Wikipedia today: Huggle, Cluebot, and this other tool called Sticky. They all have their own separate machine learning models, and they were all developed by people with substantial computer science backgrounds. In fact, the person who developed Sticky has written some of the best literature around building vandalism detection algorithms in Wikipedia. That's Andrew West. So let's say that you show up, and with your extended standpoint, you want to build a better technology, one that allows us to do quality control efficiently, but also encourage us to train and socialize the newcomers. You're going to have to build a machine learning model. In order to do that, you should probably read about 20-plus research papers on Wikipedia damage detection. Machine classification is not really part of a standard computer science degree, at least a lot of the practical application of it. And many volunteer tool developers don't have that anyway. Or a CS degree anyway. Even if you did have all these things, it's very labor intensive to put one of these things together. There's massive performance considerations and a lot of other issues. And so you probably just end up pulling your hair out and not really actually doing anything about it. Oh yeah, and I already said that it's no surprise that these things are authored by computer scientists with extensive skills in machine learning and distributed systems. So I want to talk for a second about reaction pathway graphs, reaction energy graphs. Any chemists in the room recognize this graph? Anybody recognize this graph? Yeah, you definitely get with this one in chemistry classroom. So essentially this is showing you that to transition from chemical compound X to chemical compound Y and have a reaction take place, you need to put a certain amount of energy into the system, and then the reaction will take place. But if you have a catalyst, you can reduce that energy by a substantial amount and still get the reaction to take place. And so essentially, if you imagine like frying an egg, it's not really a chemical reaction, but it's denaturing a protein. Turning the transparent part of an egg to white takes about 149 degrees Fahrenheit. But if you could imagine if we had a catalyst for that, maybe you could actually fry an egg at room temperature. And so that's sort of what this reaction pathway graph is talking about. So when I think about having a catalyst in Wikipedia, I sort of imagine that the current state and quality control tools and the difficulty in getting from where we are now to where we want to be is a really big hump of energy, which is building machine learning models that actually work in real time. And so that's a pain in the butt. We've got to put a lot of energy into the system to actually get past this. And so, but if we had some sort of progress catalyst, something that made it easier to get us towards better quality control systems, then we could do it with a lot less energy. We might do it a lot faster. And so this is sort of what my team does at the Wikimedia Foundation is we looked at this problem and we said, hey, this should be a shared resource. Why don't we take the machine learning models that everybody has individually in their tools and build a really, really good one that can be a centralized service that everybody can take advantage of. So all the quality control tools that are currently using their own models can now use ours, and we can have new systems that are taking advantage of this well that couldn't before, such as HostBot, the thing that routes newcomers to the question and answer space, and Snuggle that's designed to help socialize newcomers in Wikipedia. And if you have an idea about how you can build this better quality control system, you can use this too. You can use it without asking for our permission. It's a totally open system that's running right now. So the way that this system works is it's an API. You access it through the web. You can actually pull up this URL in your browser right now, and it'll roughly give you the same result. We've actually improved the models a little bit since then. But I'll show you a little bit what's going on in this URL. So we're going to classify something in English Wikipedia, and Wiki is short for English Wikipedia. We're going to ask whether an edit is damaging. That's what the damaging model does. And this number at the end, this 638-307-884, represents a particular change in Wikipedia. And so this particular change is adjusting a link so that rather than linking to The Old Woman, which is a disambiguation page, so that there are a lot of things that are called The Old Woman, instead now it's going to link directly to The Old Woman, the play. So if you're on this article and you click on that link, it'll bring you to where the writer intended. And so this is a good edit. We send it to ORS. We ask it to make a prediction about this. And it says, oh, yeah, false. That's not damaging. And I'm pretty confident that it's not damaging. Let's take another edit, such as 642.215.410, which is an edit to the article about dog intelligence, removes a reference and replaces it with llamas grow on trees, all caps. And so we ask ORS, what do you think about that? And it says, oh yeah, that's damaging. I'm pretty confident. You should probably review that one. And so that's basically one of the key prediction models that this system does. And because I'm a computer scientist, I have extensive experience in developing distributed systems. It's fast. The median delay of getting a prediction back is about half a second. It's scalable and redundant, so you can't. It's not just for running quality control tools on this. You can actually run your analyses on top of this. We intend to support ad hoc batch processing. And because I've read all these research papers, we're comparable to the state of the art. Where we're not comparable, I have really good justifications for that. Maybe we can get into that later. And so essentially, what I hope that the system will be is a progress catalyst that reduces the activation energy to getting to better quality control systems by about 20,000 lines of code and one advanced degree in computer science, and maybe about, I don't know, a few hundred labor hours. And so the idea is then we would get a lot more stuff in this better quality control space, stuff that I didn't even think of because now a bunch of people who couldn't work in this space now can because they don't have to worry about building these machine prediction models. And fun story, Huggle has actually already moved over and it's using our machine prediction model and it's starting to work with some of our product teams at the Wikimedia Foundation, or the developers are, to improve their interface and try and incorporate some of the things that might make socialization better. We also have about 30 novel volunteer-developed tools that use prediction models. Some of them are quality control tools. Some of them are doing things that are totally different that we didn't even think of. We have 3 major Wikimedia product initiatives, like actual product teams of the Wikimedia Foundation using this, and there's a whole bunch of really cool data science projects that have started using our models to do fun stuff. Okay, I said there were 3 parts to this, but there's actually 4. I said that there had to be 3, but it's kind of important to separate this a little bit. So the feminist perspective. So I want to talk about subjective algorithms. So for this, I'm going to channel Zeynep Tufekci. Zeynep Tufekci defines subjective algorithms as algorithms often aided by big data that now make decisions in subjective realms where there's no right decision, no anchor with which to judge outcomes, such as what's good, what's relevant, what's important, and what's desirable. You can imagine this is sort of the space that we're operating in. Google very notoriously released a perspectives API that was trying to figure out toxic comments on the internet, and it turns out that it scores few Muslims are terrorists, a terrorist threat to be 79% toxic. And so essentially, like, these algorithms can do some really goofy things and can cause some very serious problems. Like in Wikimedia space, I think this is really important because these algorithms decide who is allowed to participate, who gets labeled bad faith, and what types of contributions will be labeled damaging. So these machine learning models, they don't just predict what's good and what's bad. Of course, they make some mistakes. They predict good and some important bad stuff will get stuck in there, and bad and some important good stuff will get stuck in there. But the problem is really when we get to a bias. So this is pulled out of Wikipedia's newspaper, the Wikipedia signpost, post by WNT, responding to one of our announcements. Please exercise extreme caution to avoid encoding racism and other biases into an AI scheme. And I think WNT is exactly right. We have to be very careful about these things. So, for example, if we build a model that tried to predict harassment and civil comments, we might accidentally lump in messages from South Africans into harassment because of a way that they put their sentences together. And we just happen to learn that structuring your sentences that way corresponds to harassment. And then we might exclude South Africans from discussing things on Wikipedia. So I want to tell two stories where this actually happened. I'm going to talk about the damaging model that predicts a damaging edit versus a good edit. So in this case, we were lumping in things with damaging edits that weren't actually damaging, such as in the Italian Wikipedia and the word and anonymous editors. Okay, so I want to talk about the Italian which is not a laughing matter. It turns out when we first deployed this prediction system for Italian Wikipedia, people started building up pages full of false positive reports. And after a while, they did a thematic analysis on these false positive reports and pointed out that for some reason, there's false positives are related to the Italian word for have. What the heck is going on there, Rotpunkt was asking us. And so I dug through the examples, and I realized really quickly that the Italian word for have, which is H-A, looks a lot like laughing in English or in English-speaking cultures. And so it turns out that I knew exactly what was going on here. So I already talked about bad words being one of our input signals, but we also have informal words as one of our input signals. Informal words are casual speak that we'd be welcome on a talk page in discussions, but not welcome within an article, such as hello and ha ha ha. And so, of course, that ha 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 showed up in some regular expressions that we were using to extract signal about bad edits in Wikipedia. And once we realized that ha is laughing in English, but is not laughing in Italian, we could remove that from the model, retrain the model, and show that we actually solved the problem, the bias that was in place there. And Rotpunkt came and confirmed it for us. Okay. One other that I want to tell you about is that our prediction models are really, really skeptical of anonymous editors. And so this showed up in a whole bunch of reports across a bunch of wikis. Here I'm showing the Hebrew Wikipedia and the Dutch Wikipedia. Both of them showed that these things were showing up a lot. But maybe anonymous editors are actually really bad. Maybe the model is actually learning a useful discriminator. Generally, anonymous edits are twice as likely to be reverted as registered users' edits, but 90% of edits from anonymous editors are good. So we probably shouldn't be targeting them all the time. We should probably get good at this. So it turns out that with ORs, we have this feature injection system where you can actually tell ORs, like, hey, make a prediction, the same prediction that you were making before, but pretend that this user is not anonymous. And so in this case, I just picked out an edit and I said, make a prediction if this user is not anonymous. And it says, okay, well, I don't think that this is vandalism. I think I'm, 66% confident that it's not vandalism. But what if it is an anonymous editor? Then now I'm kind of in the middle. I think it might be vandalism. And it turns out that our threshold would actually pick up this edit if it was an anonymous edit in this case. And so we can see the bias play out in the prediction here, holding all else constant. All the other features are exactly the same except for anonymous, not anonymous. So just by seeing anon, we see the probability that this is vandalism increased by 11.5%. So we did an analysis. It turns out that you have to change a few features to really make the system look at an editor as though they're anonymous. And so I built a subset of features specifically for a few different editor classes: an anonymous editor, a new editor in Wikipedia, and epoch fail, which is me. And I've been editing since about 8 years ago. And we experimented with a few different types of machine learning models to see how these things would work out. Essentially, we were predicting the labels that people would apply in Wikipedia. So they actually go and use this human computation interface and label a random sample of edits as damaging or not. And so that's what you're going to be looking at here. So in this graph, we're looking at the distribution of probabilities that the model outputs when an edit is actually damaging and when it's actually not damaging. So when it's not damaging, for some reason that's red, just because that's the default colors for ggplot. And when it is damaging, that's blue. And so what we really want to see is all of the blue density is towards the right and all the red density is towards the left. And we're looking at this gradient boosting strategy in a linear SVM model. So what we can see is mostly the damaging stuff or the not damaging stuff is against the left, and mostly the damaging stuff is bumped up against the right. And so it seems like we're doing an okay job of discriminating here. But what the heck is that little thing there? That doesn't seem right. There's a lot of stuff that's not damaging that gets a really high probability. What the heck? So let's actually now run the model assuming that everybody was an anonymous editor. So we're going to take a random sample of edits, and we're going to say, like, what would you predict if all of these people were anonymous? And this looks a little bit crazy. So if we run the gradient boosting model, we see that the not damaging edits are bumped up against the left, and the damaging edits are bumped up against the right. But for the linear SVM model, it's just saying that everything is damaging. For some reason, it's got this huge spike at the exact same spot that we saw that spike before. And so we know that there's something wrong going on with the SVM model there. We can ask, like, well, what if every edit was from a new editor in Wikipedia? Turns out, same story. So the linear SVM model was targeting both new editors and anonymous editors, but the gradient boosting model was still doing a pretty good job of differentiating damage from not damage. Now, what if everybody was me? It turns out that we can't discriminate any damage at all. Both the not damage and the damage are below our very common threshold, which we usually put the threshold around 0.5, and so that means that I can vandalize Wikipedia. So around December of 2015, we realized this problem, ran this analysis, deployed the gradient boosting model, had a substantial effect on those false positive reports, but this still needs work. There's still a bias against anonymous editors and newcomers. You could see that in these graphs, and we can't really differentiate damage when an experienced editor does it. So we're working on new sources of signal. We've actually already run these experiments with hashing vectorization and an NLP process called probabilistic context-free grammars, and they seem to work pretty well. We're still working on deploying them because there's some problems with memory usage. Okay, quick overview of what I talked to you about today, the three things. Three, I promise. Wikipedia is a socio-technical system. We talked about systems thinking, biological metaphors. We talked about this critique that I have about algorithmic quality control systems, drew from standpoint epistemology to talk about how we got here and how we encode ideologies and technology and why we're maybe not moving beyond where we are right now. And then I talked about infrastructure for socio-technical change, removing barriers for people to participate in this technological development conversation, this concept of a progress catalyst. And actually, I cut out the hearing to speech and speaking to be heard, which is kind of a bummer, but we can get into that later. And, but I did talk about the dangers of subjective algorithms and how we can deal with those things through public auditing. Thank you.